Alright, so we're finally on the last module of Chapter 5, which is all about learning. And we talked about both classical and operant conditioning. Again, classical is all about that association between one behavior excuse me, and a kind of natural behavior. And through that pairing, we learn through association. And then we talked about operant conditioning, which is, again, learning through consequences, whether it's a positive consequence, so adding something, negative consequence, taking something away, and then if it's trying to increase a behavior, so being a reinforcement, or decrease a behavior, or punishment. Now we're going to talk about, though, cognitive ways in which we learn, because all of the first two, classical and operant, are all about behavior. So we're learning through various behaviors and, what happens based on those behaviors. So the first one is insight learning. And these are wonderful, but kind of hard to know when they're going to hit. This is that whole idea that you're like sitting in class and you just really don't understand this, and you've gone over it a million times, and all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, it makes sense. This makes perfect sense now. You have this aha moment where something just clicks, and all of a sudden something that you struggled with a lot just suddenly makes sense. This can happen when someone explains something to you in a new way. Or you do a certain example, you have a hands-on experience, it goes in the style that your brain understands, and suddenly it just clicks. Like the connections are made. That's insight learning. It's like a light bulb going off in your head. So that's what we mean about that. We don't really know when they're going to come about. It's hard to know when you're going to have that insight learning. Sometimes it takes a really long time, other times it just takes a few minutes and a few examples. Everyone's different, and it's different for different subjects as well. But part of our jobs as teachers is trying to provide as many different ways of learning and like hands-on experiences, videos, activities, all sorts of stuff to hope that this kind of learning just suddenly clicks. If that doesn't happen to you, like bug your teachers and say, hey, I'm still not getting to this, can you show me a different way? Can you explain it in a different way? Because that helps to bring out that kind of insight learning where it's that aha moment. We also have this thing known as latent learning, and I'm also going to talk about this idea of a cognitive map in this example as well. And what happened is there were rats. Psychologists like to do experiments on rats. They're easy, they got a short life, but they grow up really quick. They're good for experiments. Though, of course, humane ones now. And so what they did is they took these rats, and there are three different ones, or three different groups, I should say, group 1, group 2, and group 3. And they put these groups in a rat maze. And then, they just every day put the group in the rat maze. And so one group, if I recall this correctly, yes, one group never got a reward. And so they put them in this box, this maze, they'd run around, they'd finally make it to the end. Nothing. You just take the rat, put him back in, have at it. And so the rats would go around the maze again, they get to the end, nothing. The next group always got a reward. So if they made it to the end of the maze, they'd get a reward. So they take the rat, give him the reward. Once they got to the end, put him back in the maze. The rats would go through, and they'd get the reward again. And then, take him again, put him in the maze, etc. What's interesting is the third group. For the third group, for the first 10 days, no reward. So again, they put the rats in, the rats would get to the end of the maze, nothing. Take the rats, put them back in, run them through the maze, nothing. But then, on the 11th day, which is right here where this line is, that group suddenly got a reward. So they made it to the end of the maze, and all of a sudden, ooh, congratulations, you made it to the end, here's your cheese. And so they wanted to see what would happen. And it's kind of what you would predict for the first and second group, and I know I said them out of order, so I apologize. The group that never got a reward, you didn't really see much improvement. They weren't really working for anything, so of course, why would you see an increase? So they would take around the same amount of time to get through the maze. The group that was rewarded every single time, every single day on average got better, so they would get quicker at going through the maze. And again, this makes sense, because, this is kind of classically operant conditioning, and so they were being rewarded for that behavior, so it was increasing the likelihood of them getting through the maze as quickly as they could. The third group, though, when they weren't being given the reward, again, and this kind of purple, I don't know what it's going to look like on the screen, but the kind of purple one, you didn't see much improvement when they weren't getting the reward. But then all of a sudden, when they started getting the reward, you saw this huge change, and they actually did it better than the group that was being rewarded every single time. This is the idea of latent learning. It means that sometimes when a person isn't motivated to show that they've learned something, they won't. But they're still learning. So what had happened in that last group is the rats had learned the maze. They knew it. But there was no reward for getting out of it quick, so, they took their time. They're like, they're just going to take me out and put it back in. I might as well, spend my time in this maze, go around, talk to my buddies, it doesn't matter. It wasn't until there was suddenly something they wanted that something they were like, ooh, there's going to be cheese at the end of this maze? You know what? Let's get to that end quickly. And you remember it's that right, and then 2 lefts, and yeah, we got it. So that's latent learning. And this is really important, again, for teachers to know that sometimes if a student doesn't care, they're not going to do the work, even if they know it. And it's something that we struggle with as teachers all the time, where a lot of times they don't want to do that test. That test is boring, so they're just going to sit there and play on their phones. You have to find different ways of showing learning that works with how a student enjoys showing that they learn. And a lot of teachers would be surprised. That being said, there's always a place for tests. It's a part of life, unfortunately. But having fun ways of showing learning is something that a lot of teachers are taught to do. Because of this idea that they could be learning, we're just not trying to get the right way from them, if that makes sense. The reason why cognitive map is also on here is that's what was happening with the rats. The rats in that third group, they had this kind of imprint in their brain of, okay, yes, it's that first right and then the second left, and that, like, they knew the maze. They just had no reason to show that they knew it. But they had this cognitive map, this mental representation of directions. And we do that all the time too. If I told you, how do you get from the room you're in right now to your best friend's house? You're going to start thinking to yourself, okay, so I get out of my room and I go downstairs and I go outside and, I walk down, 2 blocks and then it's like you're going to walk through the directions. You have that cognitive map. So that's just what we mean by cognitive map. And sometimes people have it, but if they don't have an opportunity to show it or a reason to show it, you're not going to see it. And then we also have this idea of observational learning. This is also huge for parents. This is the whole idea that we learn through just observing others. So you don't necessarily have to have your own experience. So like I talked about in the very beginning of this chapter, learning is just, relatively permanent change in behavior due to an experience. The experience doesn't necessarily have to be one that you have personally. It could be an experience of watching someone else go through an experience. And so that's all observational learning is. You see something happen to someone else, or you see someone else behaving a certain way, and then you learn from that experience whether you should do that behavior or not do that behavior. And there will be a video that will be linked that was Albert Bandura. And he did something with Bobo dolls, which are those kind of weird round dolls. They have sand in the bottom, and so when you punch them, they kind of fall down a little bit, but then they come back up. And in the experiment, he had children watch parents in this playroom, and the parents were punching, beating up, lifting up, and throwing these Bobo dolls. Then the children would be, put into that room where there was all sorts of toys to play with. And so much of the time, the children would immediately go to the Bobo dolls and start punching them and lifting them up and throwing them, mimicking what they had observed. Because the idea is they had learned, just through watching what the adults did, that that was the appropriate way to behave. And so that's what we mean by observational learning. It can work in the other way as well. And this goes way back again to like our ancestors, where let's say that you're walking in the woods and you're gathering stuff for your family, and you see another person in your tribe and they're gathering food for their family, and they find, ooh, this really interesting berry. So they eat this berry, and then they drop dead. You're not going to need that experience of trying that berry to say, I'm not going to eat that berry. That berry's not good. You've learned without having to really have an experience. You just know through observing. So observational learning, not only can it teach us how we should behave, but also how we shouldn't behave. But oftentimes, like with children, it's hard for them to know right from wrong. So if they're observing parents being really angry, getting in fights and stuff like that, they misinterpret that sometimes as, ooh, that's how I should behave. And then you see, more aggression and fighting in that child. So it's very important as parents, it's very important as anyone interacting with younger individuals that you always model the proper behavior. Because you might think it's funny if, you cuss in front of a child and then they cuss as well, and it's, it's cute when they're that young, but you're still teaching them, ooh, you cuss, that's, the right thing to do. And then when they're a little older and they're getting in trouble and stuff like that, it's not quite as cute. And that being said, as my side note, cussing does have a time and a place. That's what I always teach my students. The place is just not in the school. But when, you're in pain and stuff like that, it's appropriate. Just not in school. And so those are kind of the three main things as far as cognitive learning is concerned. So again, we had that insight learning where it's just that sudden moment, those neural connections have just suddenly wired in such a way where it makes sense. It's that aha moment. We've talked about latent learning where again, they've learned, but they haven't showed us they learned until, there's something they want out of it. And then observational learning, where again, you learn just through observing what happens to other people. And that's it. So hopefully you enjoyed Chapter 5, and we'll be back for Chapter 6.